Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on headline metrics in customer satisfaction research. My name's Chris Elliott, and I'm a client manager at TLF Research. Now, I say this at all of the webinars I host, so I apologise to those in advance who have heard me before, but I'm going to get the shameless self-publicity out of the way from the start. So, at TLF, we work with clients to improve their profitability through the improvement of customer satisfaction and customer loyalty. The main tactic that we use to achieve this is through the use of highly actionable customer satisfaction research. We've got a very diverse range of clients across many sectors. What I find binds all of them together, however, is that they recognise the impact that customers can have, be it positively or negatively, on the business. As I said, the tactics of customer research are rich and varied too, ranging from large relationship research that focuses on the perception that customers have over a period of time, event-driven research that focuses on customers' experiences at a very specific touch point, and highly qualitative, design-driven work that engages organizations' efforts in changing the culture of the organization to one of more customer centricity. Now, if there's anything you'd like to know more about, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, shameless publicity done. So, headline metrics. There's a lot of headline metrics out there in business for a wide variety of applications. But for customer satisfaction research, 3 headlines stand out more than most. The Customer Satisfaction Index score, the Net Promoter Score, or NPS, and the relatively new kid on the block, the Customer Effort score. And so in this webinar, we'll look at all of 3 of these metrics in an effort to identify which metric is actually best for your business. But before we do this, we must ask a question. Why do we need a headline metric? Well, experience tells me that there are lots of reasons why we use a headline metric, but broadly, I think there are 3 groups of organizations that use them. There's organizations that use them as a headline metric for a balanced scorecard or to appear on a balanced scorecard. Headline metrics are also often used to highlight the progress that's made towards an overall objective. And also headline metrics are used to performance manage both internally and externally. So which is best? Well, let's start by looking at each metric in a little more detail, and we'll begin with the Customer Satisfaction Index score. Now, the Customer Satisfaction Index first made its headlines in America in the early to mid 1990s. Developed by the University of Michigan, the premise behind the index score was that it considered 3 aspects of the relationship that we have with our customers. And very specifically, it focused on what is our overall level of satisfaction? Did the experience meet our expectations? And how does it compare to our ideal perfect experience? Now, the index continues to be used today in America, but like most metrics, they spawn hybrids and evolvements, and the Customer Satisfaction Index that's now used in the UK and used by TLF has different components. The UK index is a weighted score out of 10 that uses scores for satisfaction and ratings for importance on a series of core needs of the customer. The weighting of all of the requirements ensures that actually most important needs of customers have potentially the greatest influence on overall satisfaction. Now, the Customer Satisfaction Index score has a number of benefits. The first is that the index looks through the lens of the customer, as opposed to looking through the lens of the organization. In short, what it's doing is it's measuring the needs of the customer, needs that have been identified by actually speaking to customers. It's a metric that assumes that we now know what is important to customers by speaking to customers, rather than actually thinking we know what is important. And also by doing this, it ensures that the survey reflects the full complexity of the customer experience. A customer experience that has different components involved within it, be it from product, from price, to brand and information. Another benefit of the index, and arguably a benefit for all headline metrics, is its ability to be benchmarked against other organisations, allowing you to see the progress, or the lack of progress in some cases, that's made with the improvement of satisfaction overall. A criticism, however, is often that the index is hard to understand. As you can see there, the index is expressed as a percentage, and often a percentage refers to a volume measurement. But in this case, with the customer index, this is not the case. And I often tell my clients to strip it back a layer and think of it as a weighted score out of 10. In this instance, 80.2% would be referred as 8.02 out of 10. Another criticism of the index is that it's a complex metric and it's hard to calculate. I indeed myself thought this when I first experienced the index for the first time. But the reality is that it's a relatively simple calculation once you get the hang of it. So that's the customer satisfaction index. Now let's move on to the next metric, and arguably the most popular metric out there, which of course is the Net Promoter Score, or NPS, as it's often known as. The Net Promoter Score was launched by Fred Reichheld, one of the modern day gurus, if we're to call them, of customer satisfaction and loyalty. It was launched in 2003 within the Harvard Business Review. The title of it was known as the one number you need to grow, which of course then spawned the book, The Ultimate Question. Now, whilst the Net Promoter Score has spawned some hybrid measures, the mechanics of the Net Promoter Score has remained more consistent than other headline metrics. So let's have a look at the question and the scale. The question is, how likely or unlikely are you to recommend a product or a service? Now, this question is often extended to your friends and family, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And the scale used is a 0 to 10 scale typically, where 0 indicates that you are highly unlikely to recommend and that 10 indicates you are highly likely to recommend. Now, the calculation of the Net Promoter Score is really quite easy. We scale the score into 3 different groups. People that give a score between 0 and 6 are defined as detractors, people who are highly unlikely to recommend. Then we have people who give a score of 7 and 8. They're defined as passives, neither likely nor unlikely to recommend. And finally, we have people who give scores between 9 and 10, defined as promoters, highly likely to recommend. The Net Promoter Score is simply calculated by subtracting the proportion of detractors from the promoters, giving you a number. Easy. So what do we think? Well, the main reason for its popularity is that the metric and its means of calculation is really easy. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's so popular in the senior exec boardroom. However, the Net Promoter Score does have some criticisms. The first is that Net Promoter Score is a volatile metric, and it requires really high volumes for it to be a stable measure. I've seen from experience that high customer satisfaction index scores on low volumes of responses often deliver very low Net Promoter Scores. And herein lies another criticism, and it really sort of looks at the 7s and the 8s that we define as passives, and for the Net Promoter Score we completely ignore. And I'm going to use a quote that I found recently to demonstrate that one of the criticisms that we have with these two numbers. If we consider that 7 and 8 are passive and we completely ignore them for the Net Promoter Score, if we all adopted this view that 8 was as good as you could get, then arguably the very best Net Promoter Score you would ever get would be 0. And 0 would, of course, be naturally a very low score. So there's often a criticism that 8 being defined as passive is wrong, and therefore 8 should be defined as also as being a promoter. And another criticism that we have with Net Promoter Score is that it is a conversational metric. I mentioned earlier that often how likely are you to recommend to friends and family is used. Think about that for a moment. Friends and family. Conversations with friends and family are casual. They're conversations around the dinner table, in the bar, casual conversations. If we think about the National Health Service's Friends and Families test, which whilst being a different methodology is still a measure of recommendation. Think about it. Have we ever recommended the local casualty department where we near live to be the place to go if you have a broken leg? Just doesn't quite work that way. So let's have a look now at the final metric in this webinar, the customer effort score. I said at the beginning that this was a relatively new concept compared to Customer Satisfaction Index and Net Promoter Score. It was launched in 2010 in an article in the Harvard Business Review by Matthew Dixon. The article, titled "Stop Trying to Delight Your Customers," argued that exceeding expectations doesn't impact on loyalty in the way that you might think. The article also made a case for customer effort being more indicative of future spend than other headline customer metrics. However, for me, the real moral of the article was that it's really important to try and make life as easy as possible for your customers. But the article also introduced the original effort question. Now, before I get going, I just want to add that I'm personally a really big fan of the overall concept of ease. However, the original question and scale for me don't really work. Let's start with the scale. Now, in customer satisfaction research, typically there are 2 scales used, verbal scales and numerical scales. And we've got a verbal scale here, excellent. The numerical scales here are really good for statistical analysis. But there's always a challenge with numerical scales in that what we want to have is we want to have the right blend of understanding and also granularity. Now, if we think about a question mark over this scale, the 5-point scale, we can easily understand a 5-point scale, but we don't get the granularity. And what we also get is a phenomenon called courtesy 4. If you're presented with a 5-point numerical scale, 5 means that really it's as good as it can get, and we often don't go with 5. But equally, 3 we feel like we're shortchanging an organisation. So it typically is loaded heavily in favour of 4, the mode number. Now let's have a look at a 10-point numerical scale. Still easy to understand, but now you also get a better blend of granularity. And if we think that the 4 is the mode number on a 5-point scale, then for a 10-point scale, it would be 8 out of 10. But there's a much greater distribution of scores across 6 to 9, a better blend of granularity with ease of understanding. Now, the biggest criticism of the original question is the question itself. How much effort did you personally have to put forth to handle your request? It's a bit of a mouthful, and it doesn't really slip off the tongue. And this is why customer effort has spawned more versions and alternative sort of versions than any other metric. Now, at TLF, we tend to use one of the following. How easy are you to deal with, or how easy are you to do business with? Now, I really like these questions because I think they get more to the nub of what we're wanting to find out. So let's go back to the subject of the webinar. Which of these metrics is best? I actually don't think there's a definitive answer to this. And I'm going to hide behind an article again from this most wonderful of publications, the Harvard Business Review, that actually asked the same question. And it said this: you need to be very careful what you use your metrics for. The growing reliance on a simple single metric is a very dangerous trend. After all, if we visit a doctor for a checkup, we wouldn't want the doctor to rely solely on body temperature to assess our overall health, would we? And I think that's a really good way to look at headline metrics. They often reflect very different stages of the journey that a customer has. If we look at the service profit chain, you can see there that customer satisfaction clearly leads to loyalty. High customer satisfaction, higher loyalty. Low customer satisfaction, disloyalty. And often a question that's asked is, how do I improve loyalty? And they often revert to the single metric, the Net Promoter Score. What I tend to say to my clients is, I say, think of loyalty as a byproduct, and it's a byproduct of satisfaction. So arguably, you improve loyalty and you improve your Net Promoter Score by improving customer satisfaction. Here's another chart that I use time and time again with all of my clients that demonstrates how satisfaction and loyalty are closely linked. The bars that you see at the bottom represent the proportions of people for their customer satisfaction index score. And if we look at the one on the far right, 14% of respondents have an index of 86% and over. That's 8.6 out of 10 and higher. What we know with this research, it tells us that people who are highly satisfied are highly likely to recommend, are highly likely to actually use the organization again. So retention, another loyalty metric, arguably. But they also view the organization as very easy to do business with. And that's vice versa. Highly dissatisfied customers are highly unlikely to recommend, are highly unlikely to use them again, and also view them as being very difficult to do business. Another way that you can use composite measures or more than one measure is on a chart that looks something similar to this. Now the scales are, on the bottom scale, the overall satisfaction, and on the left-hand side, the scale is actually the likelihood of being a customer, which is a retention, but you can use recommendation here. And the box that's in the red in the bottom left-hand corner, well, those are the customers that are displaying relatively low scores for satisfaction and highly unlikely to use them again. Customers that we would define as at risk and people that should as a priority be approached and spoken to straight away. So I go back to the article. You've got to be very careful about which metric you go for. And there's nothing wrong with plucking one headline metric out there. But my recommendation would always be to have a composite set of metrics that will always talk with each other, that will always complement each other, because I think that's a much more effective and efficient approach to have. So I hope that webinar has been interesting and informative for you. Thank you very much for joining us. If you have any questions at any time, please don't hesitate to email me on the email that you see there on the screen, or equally, please get in touch with us via our website at tlfresearch.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you very much for attending the webinar this afternoon. Just to let you know that we have various other webinars and courses you can book onto. One course we are holding in London is the Customer Insight Conference on the 17th of May this year. You can book on our website or call the office. Just looking, there is a question here from one of the webinars attendees. How do you manage to get data to measure all three, CSat, NPS and CES, to use them together without overwhelming your customers with surveys? All three metrics require for different questions to be asked.
It's a good question, and yeah, I mean, obviously there is a danger when you want to ask all of those questions. You do have to ask them as absolutely separate questions, The customer effort score, whichever version you choose to use is one question, net promoter score is one question, and the index is a whole series of questions. And I think the challenge, and I think this is actually one of the things that is often misinterpreted from Fred Reichheld when he launched Net Promoter Score. The view is often that you should just ask that one question. And I don't think that's correct. I think that what he's saying is that the Net Promoter Score is the one question you need to know, but he's not suggesting it's the one question you should only be asking. Now, my experience tells me that you can do all of those three without overburdening the respondent. And I think it comes down to just really good questionnaire design. And when you look through the lens of the organization, I haven't really talked about this, it's a questionnaire that's often designed internally by management. It's often a questionnaire that's filled with a load of questions that person actually probably wants to know, not necessarily what the customer wants to tell you. If you've got through really good questionnaire design and it's looking through the lens of the customer, I think that customers, my experience tells me that customers are much more prepared to answer more questions than you would believe for so long as they are looking through their perspective. But it is a big challenge. And design is really key. You've got to get it right. And what we definitely don't want is a really long, overburdening question, because that ultimately would be counterproductive. But it is possible, and we do it, day in, day out. But good question.